Don't we love Nathan? One of the great, another one of the great gifts that Bob Seymour gave to our church, Megan. And so glad we got hooked in with her. So we're going to start with a review of the book, because next week is our last class. So let's just sort of, again, let's just sort of remember some of the big parts that we've already looked at. And in this very almost anecdotal way, he doesn't cite any studies. He doesn't say, according to the American Medical, there's nothing like that. It's really about his own observations about human nature, the context of which he lived. Of course, he was born in Florida, lived most of his life growing up in Daytona Beach. He then goes to a Baptist high school far away in Jacksonville, because there were no black high schools in Daytona. So he goes there. Then he goes off to college, ends up in Rochester, New York, integrates a dorm in Rochester because he felt like that was what he should do. Then ends up going back to Atlanta, or going back to the South, ends up in Atlanta at Howard. He goes to San Francisco, and which we now know is the second least air-conditioned city in America. First. He's not there all that long. In fact, one of you asked me if that church is still in existence. That particular congregation isn't, but the idea of an intentional interfaith congregation did take hold. And there are a few of those around the country. I would point out that there is in, of all places, Omaha, Nebraska, such a place that has on their campus a Christian, Jewish, and Muslim worship centers. And then periodically there are gatherings of those three Abrahamic traditions in learning, so that they keep their identity, but they also widen their identity. You catch that the particularities of the tradition are still honored and developed and taught within this larger, bigger, deeper tradition of we're all human beings. It's a pretty, that's almost scandalous for some people who are afraid that such a way of being is just too radical. Anyway, then he goes back. He ends up writing more books. This one, of course, grew out of a magazine article that he wrote, but the book is produced in 1944. And in this chapter today, he makes a lot of reference to the war. So he starts with an interpretation of the life of Jesus, which is that the religion of Jesus prepared him for what it would be to be on the underside of history and to be on the receiving end of abuse, oppression, disdain, and hostility. He says very matter-of-factly that Jesus is on the side of the oppressed, because Jesus was in fact oppressed. And not just Jesus, but Jesus' folks. People like Jesus. A poor Jewish peasant who was misunderstood and in the minority. Hello, Amy. Hello. Good to see you. Welcome. We're looking at this book by Howard Thurman today, Jesus and the Disinherited. He makes the point that when you have your back against the wall, whether you're an Asian American living under suspicion and ridicule because you're Asian American after the war in America. If you're an African American in the Deep South, or really anywhere, you are on the receiving end of being pushed with your back against the wall. Where does Jesus and the religion of Jesus, we might say the church, where does it help a person in that predicament? And if it's not helping a person in that predicament, then is it worthy of being called Christian? I think that's the number one question he's basically raising, that the church often is simply reflecting cultural norms instead of being countercultural, especially as it relates to relating to human beings. So he sketches out what he calls the three hounds of hell: fear, hypocrisy. Oh, on the way over here, they played in honor of Tom T. Hall, who died yesterday. They played Harper Valley PTA. He wrote that song. Do y'all know that song?
Yeah.
Do you know what I'm talking about? Jeannie C. Riley sang that, but he wrote it, talking about hypocrisy. And today, hatred. Fear is expressed in how do you manage your life in the midst of such oppression. Do you go along to get along? Do you accommodate? Do you just receive it and internalize it? Or do you lash out and do you become violent? And then today, with hatred, how does Jesus deal with being hated? And how is it that how Jesus dealt with it could be a clue as to how we might move through that? And the person who is being oppressed. So I want to begin our time with a couple of months ago I made reference to this book, How the Word is Passed, which is by Clint Smith, subtitled A Reckoning with the History of Slavery Across America. And of course, as y'all know, just a spate of books have been written within the last 3 to 5 years because of Black Lives Matter. And I put this one at the top of that work of important books. A lot of things have come out, written by black and white authors. This is an African American man. And it's really instructive to see how it was that African Americans who were held in slavery made in their interior lives their identity as a slave. That the scarring and the scar tissue that's left behind when you are identified and your identity is as a slave. Well, Smith is also a poet, and he won a slam poetry contest with this poem entitled Ode to the Only Black Kid in the Class. You, it seems, are the manifestation of several lifetimes of toil, brown versus board in the flesh. Most days the classroom feels like an antechamber. You are deemed expert on all things Morrison, King, Malcolm, Rosa. Hell, weren't you sitting on that bus too? You are everybody's best friend until you are not. Hip-hop lyricist, presumed athlete, free and reduced sideshow, exception and caricature, too black and too white all at once. If you are successful, it is because of affirmative action. If you fail, it is because you were destined to. You are invisible until they turn on the Friday night lights. Here you are, star, before they render you asteroid, before they watch you turn to dust. And in those 12 lines, 10 lines, he really does capture how it is you go and understand your life as a black man in America. And to be on the receiving end of what Thurman is going to call contact but without fellowship, without knowing somebody. Just understood, well, you are a basketball player, aren't you? So keep this in mind as we go through the lesson. So, hatred. Hatred, chapter 4, page 64 in my edition of the book. Hatred grows out of a lot of different things. Mainly, like pornography, it's not so much you can define it, but you know it when you see it. And hatred, you not only know it when you see it, but you know it when you hear it. So it's both a visual and an oral situation. Hating and hatred is described in 4 steps from him. And again, what I think is so great about this book, but this chapter in particular, is it just sort of spins out of, here are my observations of being in the world as a black man. A learned, gifted, passionate, and powerful black man, but nonetheless it just sort of is carved out as sort of not just anecdotal, but very personal. He says, here are the 4 steps in describing hatred. Hatred begins in a situation in which there is contact without fellowship. What does he mean by that? Describe that. Before I call on you.
Well, it's the next little town, away from you, right? There's no hatred more bitter than for the people down the road, right? So you have some contact with them, but no real connection.
Right.
They're other.
But you think you know them.
Right.
Right. I mean, that's always implicit, right? That, yeah, you know them. Contact without fellowship. And the fellowship part is key here, because fellowship implies
getting to know somebody.
Exactly. But just sort of setting down. Travel does this better than anything else, right, in the world. When you travel to other countries, even hot Seattle, you are meeting people, you're getting to know mores, subcultures within a larger culture, and you're being exposed to things, and it changes. But when you don't have that contact, when you don't have that fellowship, all you're doing is being a tourist, not a sojourner. And so that's number 1. Hatred often begins in a situation in which there is contact without fellowship. Let me go back to page 64, though, for just a second, when he identifies being in a cab in Chicago, and the cabbie at the red light says, in response to Asians, "Who do they think they are, those little yellow dogs?"
Well, when I was in college, I went to a small Presbyterian-related school,
In North Texas,
It's in North Texas, north
where
of
all
Dallas.
of God's good children are from.
Anyway, at that school, I met two Japanese women. Now, this is the 60s, so it's 20 years later, but you still got the sense that, here, I can see them as individuals, because we were in the same dorm, we got to know one another, I actually roomed with one of them at one time, and yet you would also hear people talk about the Japs.
Yes, yes.
We weren't that far away from the war, so that's what I was thinking about when I read that.
Right. Yeah, that's a great example. And he makes the point in the book that everybody does that. That's part of the interior work that we all have to do. He says pretty bluntly, if you think only white people hate blacks, you haven't been in our culture, because black people can hate white people just as easily, and do. So imagine reading that for the first time when you have been in the dynamic of the relationship, you have been on the receiving end as being inferior.
And of course, he's writing this at a time when we hated Orientals because they bombed Pearl Harbor. But a year ago, we were being whipped into a frenzy in this country to hate other Orientals because of a virus. So it's the same thing 50 years apart, but it's the same dynamic.
Absolutely. In fact, nothing says that better than it was very simple. Hatred could be brought out into the open, given a formal dignity and a place of respectability. I see someone coming down an escalator about to demean an entire group of Latinos. We all experienced, I think, over the last 5 years or so, this out in the openness that surprised us. In Charlottesville, Virginia, with tiki torches, you will not replace us, the Jews will not replace us, blacks will not replace us, and they didn't even need a hood.
I actually think it goes back to 2009 with Obama's election.
Oh, absolutely. But
we were stunned at we thought it had all gone away. This was the epitome. Electing a black president, there would be no racism. Oh wait, it just...
Right.
It
Jimmy
was all
Carter,
over.
I heard Jimmy Carter in an interview as soon as the election was declared for Obama, saying, in essence, we are about to see a rise in prejudice and hateful speech that we've never seen in a long time. And he was, of course, prophetic. So the first one, contact without fellowship. He makes the point on page 66 how so much of life is impersonal. This is in 44. This is pre-cell phone. Two, contacts without fellowship tend to express themselves in the kind of understanding, we should put that in quotes, that is strikingly unsympathetic. How does that spin out? What's an example of that? That contact without fellowship sort of then just sort of mutates, delta-like, into a understanding that is unsympathetic. If I haven't put roots down in the relationship, then I'm not going to be particularly sympathetic to your cause because I don't know you. And even if I did know you or think I knew you, because I'm in the dominant superior position, then I really don't have to work all that hard. And I won't. Very often we use, excuse me, I understand to mean something, very often we use the phrase I understand to mean something kindly, warm, and gracious. But there is an understanding that is hard, cold, minute, and deadly. It is the kind of understanding that one gives to the enemy, or that is derived from an accurate knowledge of another's power to injure. There is an understanding of another's weakness, which may be used as a weapon of offense or defense. Understanding that is not the outgrowth of an essential fellow feeling is likely to be unsympathetic. Of course, there may be pity in it, even compassion sometimes, but sympathy, almost never. I can sympathize only when I see myself in another's place. Go ahead.
Oh, I was just going to say, I said this to Jan when I read the first few pages of this. I was reminded of two things. One is we visited in 18, I guess it was, Montpelier.
Yeah.
And now that Montpelier's been taken over by the National Trust, there's far more emphasis on the Madisons, and one of the emphasis down there is on how the Madisons were able to do what they could do because of the slaves. So I mean, they're very upfront about that. But one of the things there that I thought was interesting is it said the difference between the North and the South was that the North liked blacks collectively and feared them individually. The South liked them individually but feared them collectively. So I thought that was interesting. And the understanding reminded me of the lines from the TV show 2.5 Men, where the Charlie character says, what you need to know is when I say I understand, I don't understand, I don't care, it just seems to make people feel better when I say it. So that came to me when I was reading this.
Now friends, you're not getting this at First Methodist today.
Yeah.
Carter and 2.5 Men, that's great. No, that's really on, and that your understanding of in the North and in the South, that antipathy was, given in different forms to different people, the collective versus the individual. I think that's a really important point.
To me, this piece is the concept of stereotyping.
Yeah.
I mean, it's just fascinating that he's, through his own mind, seeing such big concepts that are clear to us now and have whole literatures and
Yeah, millions of books like this, citing all kinds of studies appropriately.
Right.
But still, in this book produced in 44, it's just, there is an accessibility to this book that I really appreciate. Okay, so contact without fellowship, unsympathetic understanding. So 1 + 1 equals this: active functioning of ill will. And he tells the story of, again, from Chicago to Memphis. And he's on a train, and the conductor came along for the tickets. A white elderly woman, what is that? Not who, but what is that doing in this car? So for the next 50 miles, she talks to everyone all around her, doesn't speak to him. I was able to see, top of 68, the atmosphere in the entire car shift from common indifference to active recognition of, and to some extent, positive resentment of my presence. An ill will spreading its virus by contagion. I mean, that example, yeah, so just someone's presence, almost giving the dominant party permission to not just show their prejudice, but to persecute and prosecute that prejudice. And then fourthly, ill will, when dramatized in a human being, becomes hatred walking on the earth. And that's his outline. In 4 pages, he's given you a pretty, I would say, accurate portrayal of hatred. That when it is so cultivated, then your entire personhood can be seen as hatred walking the earth. It was said of St. Francis that he was peace walking on earth. Just think of the contrast of a Francis to a KKKer or your neighbor. You know, we don't need to go to the KKK for examples, do we? Your in-laws, that brother-in-law that, you know, I hope you have a good brother-in-law. So now he fills this in. So how is it? How does how do the disinherited respond to that? And sometimes they will respond in ways that themselves fall into the trap of hatred, which is, of course, one of the reasons why Dr. King, William Barber, Howard Thurman, all of them keep going back to the idea of hatred cannot drive out hatred, darkness cannot drive out darkness. The only thing that will do that is love. Hatred, top of 69, hatred in the mind and spirit of the disinherited is born of great bitterness and sustained resentment. He gives the example of being in a family of 5, and when you are on the receiving end of not getting the extra bit of food, or hatred then becomes for you a source of validation for your personality. Well, you know, I'm this way because I remember when Mama, XYZ, I remember when my granddaddy, ABC, and then there you go, and then that's my reason. I didn't win most outstanding boy in the 6th grade at Urban Park Elementary in Dallas, Texas. Oh, I'm sorry. I really deserved it, Amy. Keith Miller won it.
Where is he now?
Probably drunk. Erase that. I think he went on to a minor league baseball career, actually. So Keith, if you're watching, no offense.
And that could have been yours.
What?
That could have been yours.
Well, could have and should have.
Absolutely.
Robbed. You were robbed.
Okay, page 72. When hatred serves as a dimension of self-realization, the illusion of righteousness is easy to create. I just think that is such a good word. That when your self-identity and self-actualization is really underscored with your hatred, and that it's hard to separate the two, then you can create a whole moral code for yourself and others. And that moral code then allows you to keep on hating. I don't have to tell y'all that right there takes up several pews in any church. Yes, ma'am.
Is he talking about theistic evolution?
Is he talking about what?
Theistic evolution as an excuse for slavery.
I don't know. It's a very good, that's an insightful, but I don't know. I don't know. But I would say that when Samuel Hill, who died not long ago, who was a member of this church when he taught at UNC in the history department, he wrote a book, Southern Churches in Crisis. And the thesis of that book is that one reason the churches in the South are in crisis is because the race issue, which they should have been identified as being against racism, but not being against racism by and large, has left them without any moral authority, except for people who wanted to keep on benefiting and producing the dominant pattern. You see that? I mean, that is what was at stake. And so the lost cause, remember that whole concept of the lost cause? That then becomes that self-realization. And it gets manifested in so many different ways. Within the churches even, not even, maybe even especially, because you can create your illusion of righteousness. American boys, this is 73, have grown up in a culture and a civilization in which they have absorbed certain broad attitudes of respect for human personality and other traits, characteristics of gentlemen of refinement and dignity. Something radical, that we're talking about soldiers and the war, has to happen to their personality and their overall outlook to render them more effective tools of destruction. So they hate the enemy. Then that hatred will immunize them from a loss of moral self-respect, as they do to the enemy what is demanded of them in the successful prosecution of the war. This is why, right now, there is such an amazing level of research and literature around moral woundedness, that part of the wounds of war have everything to do what he has written about right here. That in order for you to be the killing machine either in Vietnam or Iran, Iraq, Afghanistan, whatever it is, but particularly World War, Korea, but particularly World War II, you had to then gin up hatred in order to justify killing another human being. Forget that they were of a different country and maybe reflecting different values. They're another human being. There are some people who cannot tell you face to face precisely what they think of you unless they get angry first. That can happen at the dinner table, can't it? Or the family reunion. I won't tell my cousin Vicky's story, but I think I just did. 75. Hatred seems to serve a creative purpose. I would put, again, creative in quotes. So again, now, so what? What about Jesus? So this is 75 through the end of this short chapter. Jesus understood this. What must have passed through Jesus' mind when he observed the contemptuous disregard for the Jews by the Romans, whose power had closed in on Israel? What thoughts raced through his mind when Judas of Galilee raised his rallying banner of defiance, sucking into the tempest of his embittered spirit? Is it reasonable to assume that Jesus did not understand the anatomy of hatred? For in the face of the obvious facts of his environment, he counseled against hatred. And his word, love your enemies. Despite all the positive psychological attributes of hatred we have outlined, hatred destroys finally the core of the life of the hater. I can remember hearing George Wallace's daughter maybe 3-4 years ago. And she was recounting her dad's virulent racism, of course, and the influence that Cornelia, his second or third wife, had on him. And so she was recounting a story of John Lewis, the late John Lewis, and her dad. And basically John Lewis and Wallace were talking about forgiveness. And Wallace says to John Lewis, do you think God will ever forgive me for destroying my own life? Not just the lives of, And Lewis said, God already has forgiven you. But will you forgive me, John? I've already forgiven you, George. If hatred can destroy the core of the hater, love just might be the trick to restore someone to life, which will be the next chapter. The white heat, hot light of hatred, its effects. Human hatred bears deadly and bitter fruit. It's blind and non-discriminating. Anybody can hate. Anybody has the power to do that by exercising specific discrimination, especially when you feel that persons that you are hating bear direct responsibility for your own status in life. Let me say that again. Especially when you are ready to blame others for your own situation in life. Being a person is hard work. It's not as easy as it looks. And it's consuming. 77, above and beyond all else, it must be borne in mind that hatred tends to dry up the springs of creative thought in the life of the hater, so that his resourcefulness becomes completely focused on the negative aspects of his environment. It's all consuming. He becomes lopsided, a cripple in reverse. And what an image that is. But Jesus rejects hatred. Jesus rejected hatred because he saw, bottom of 77, top of 78, he saw that hatred meant death to the mind, death to the spirit, death to communion with God. He affirms life, and hatred was the great denial of life. So, you need to get to know transgendered folk. You need to get to know any group of people that you would be readily, even unconsciously, and I know I'm with the most liberal of the liberals here, but you have to keep pressing yourself, don't you, for these blind spots. Yes, ma'am?
we've talked about this in our family because our kids grew up in high schools where they will go back a bit to having gay organizations open and so, but you have to be in a position to get to know those people. And
Right.
if you don't have them in your circle, that's kind of hard to do. But our daughter said, for her still, the idea of the transgenders is she's not familiar with that. So that's
Right.
a little harder now. So while she's gays and lesbians, that's one thing. The other is, again, I haven't had the exposure, and until the more that becomes, that we're exposed to it, the more people will accept it.
Right. And the greater the environment for someone to be open about it,
Yes.
that is, that's what's happened with LGBT issues, right? That is what created the possibility for somebody being able to be open, the reaction response. For a long, long time, as my kids would say, before Will and Grace, you couldn't be so open, Yeah, Bert.
For me, the challenge now is to understand and reach out to, the COVID denier,
Oh
the Trump
gosh,
supporter.
now you're really stepping on us.
Right. There are people, there are groups of people that I've stereotyped and hate. And so it's easy, to
Yes.
forget that we are still doing that, or I am.
Oh, I think you're speaking for every one of us. Yes. It's like being human is hard. And it's incredibly difficult. Because we can hate just as well as a fundamentalist.
Your comments about stereotyping, I need a little introduction to get to my point, so bear with me for a moment. We have some neighbors that Jan and I are getting to know, and we like them, and I'm sure we'll get to know them better. The long of their story is that this is a second marriage for them, but both of them were born in Jamaica. Now, he grew up in Jamaica, and how they met later in life to get married as a second marriage, we haven't gotten to that point yet. But she left Jamaica very young to grow up in Canada. And she got her degree, and again, need to know more, at Chapel Hill, and she's either an NP or a PA in the Duke system over in Durham now. But Rose told us that, again, because of the stereotypes, African Americans, with her not having shared the African American experience, they don't relate to her even though she is a black woman. And the whites expect her to be, because she's a black woman, they expect her to have had the African American experience. And so
that's this point.
Yeah, and that's right. So this is something that she's dealing with in her life. And again, I want to talk with her more about that to get to know her. To me, that was just so fascinating to hear that from someone that both groups stereotype her because of her physical appearance, but that's not who she is at all.
Right, yeah. One last word about the life of the disinherited, because they too have work to do. And that's part of what he's trying to get at here. And that is, you, black person, you need to try and understand white folks. You, Jew, you need to try and understand life as a Presbyterian, or a Christian perspective. Not to agree with it, but to understand where someone is coming, what has gone into their makeup, rather than me stereotyping you. And that's the give and take of all of this. That's when, in a community where you can do that without fear, but with joy and not fake understanding, but real understanding, not shallow, superficial intimacy, but real connectedness. When you can do that, you got a good community. And we need to say bye to our virtual friends.